The housing crisis in Australia is going from bad to worse, with the rates of homelessness skyrocketing across the entire country. But on the other hand, millions of property investors have literally hit the jackpot since COVID, with house prices going up by an average of 34% across the country. Now, with those ridiculous speculative housing gains, a huge number of renters are now locked out of the housing market and may never be able to afford their own home. So with such a gloomy financial future for a massive section of the community, more and more people are asking why property investors continue to benefit from negative gearing when it costs the government billions of dollars and hands them an unfair advantage against those who are just trying to buy their first home. Pressure's building on the government to overhaul tax concessions, so we might finally get to say goodbye to negative gearing for good. I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. A lot of people have pets, and some even have exotic type pets. But I think I'm the only person who's ever had a pet termite. I named my pet termite Clint. Clint eats wood. And you know what's better than eating wood? Subscribing to my bloody YouTube channel. So please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. And together, we'll rule the galaxy as father and son.
There is no escape. Don't make me destroy you.
What exactly is negative gearing and why is it so controversial? Negative gearing occurs when the cost of owning a rental property outweighs the income it generates each year. This creates a taxable loss which can normally be offset against other income, including your wage or salary. Now, using negative gearing to be able to afford expensive rental properties is one of the cornerstone strategies for property investment in Australia. Check out this video for an example.
Now, if you're buying a $1 million investment property, you're going to incur property purchase costs. That means the total cost to purchase a property, $1,050,000. The average gross rental income, so total headline rent, is 3.71%. That means on a $1 million property, you're going to get $37,100 in rent every single year.
And you'll find that the average rent yields in the most expensive housing markets are lower than 3.7%, with the average rental yield in Sydney coming in at 3%.
On top of that, you've got your property related expenses. You've got things like strata, maintenance, insurances, those sorts of things. Rough numbers that equates to about 1% of the property value every single year. So on a $1 million property, that's $10,000 every year. Then you've got your mortgage interest costs. Now, I've used the average mortgage variable rate at the moment, which is 6.77% as per Finder. That means your total mortgage interest costs $71,085. That brings your total cost to $81,085 every year. But then when you take off the 37 grand that you get in rent, that means the total out of pocket cost to you $43,985 every single year.
Now, this example assumes no real deposit, but that's still a massive out-of-pocket loss that you're getting on that property investment.
Now, that's not exactly what you pay, because when you own an investment property, you're able to claim that as a tax deduction, that $43,000.
And that is because of negative gearing, baby.
Assuming that your income is above $45,000 a year and your tax rate is above 34.5%, that means you're going to get a tax refund of $15,175 each year. If your marginal tax rate is higher, you will get more of a refund, but just to use some conservative numbers there.
So you make a property investment that loses around $45,000 a year and you get a tax refund of 15 grand or more. All the while, millions of Australians can't afford their own home because they're getting taxed to the hilt on their wages, and what's left has to pay their soaring rents and ridiculous cost of living. On what planet does this make sense? Maybe Uranus.
So you're out of pocket $43,900, you get back $15,000 in tax. That means the total cost to you is $28,810 every year. Now, you might be wondering why on earth you would buy an investment property if it's going to cost you $28,000 a year. And the simple answer is because that property is going to increase in value over time, so long as you choose a good one.
It's basically guaranteed to increase in value in Australia because the government and central bank have proven that they'll do everything in their power to prop up the housing market.
The long-term growth rate on the Australian property market is 6.3%, meaning your $1 million property should grow by $63,000 every year. So you're paying $28,000 to make $63,000. That's a pretty sweet deal.
Australia's #1 wealth creation strategy in a nutshell. Buy an investment property that you can't afford and that actually loses you money, and as a reward for losing that money, you get a fat, juicy tax concession. And this allows you to keep the property that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to afford. Now on the surface, this doesn't seem like such a great deal, but when you understand that the Australian housing market is run like a giant Ponzi scheme with house prices basically guaranteed to rise way faster than wages, you'll gladly negatively gear as many properties as humanly possible. Why on earth would you take a risk like starting up a new business when you get great tax concessions combined with unbelievable capital gains?
Negative gearing of property has been super effective at making a small army of well-off Australians even richer, which is great news for them. But to even the playing field for Aussies who are struggling to pay rent or buy a house, some pollies are screaming for the government to scale it back.
It shouldn't just be pollies screaming. All of Australia should be up in arms as far as I'm concerned. Whether you own property or not, we need to make sure we have a fair tax system so future generations can thrive both economically and socially instead of being kicked to the curb.
Some pollies are now agitating for change.
It is part of the reason that we're having a housing crisis out there.
If Labor can change on stage 3 tax cuts, they can change on negative gearing and capital gains.
I think they have to be on the table.
Yes, it must be discussed and action should be taken right now. And Australian political parties need to look past just getting elected and think about what's best for the entire country going into the future.
Let's be real. If Labor wants to deal with housing affordability, then it's time to phase out the billions of dollars in tax concessions property investors get every year in the form of negative gearing and capital gains tax concessions.
It should be pointed out that Labor did try to phase out these tax concessions when Bill Shorten took those policies to 2 separate elections, but lost them both. That was an excellent opportunity to reduce some of that speculative demand for property, but sadly it didn't happen, and now the speculation for Australian property has basically skyrocketed.
Labor is understandably gun-shy after taking negative gearing changes to the 2019 election. Their changes would have limited negative gearing to new properties only, which would have increased supply and dropped house prices between 5 and 12%, according to modelling.
I get it. They all want to get re-elected, but are we willing to throw an entire section of the community, renters, under the proverbial bus just to keep the Australian housing Ponzi going? Or are we as a nation gonna grow some bloody balls and do whatever it takes to improve housing affordability for all Australians?
We could be investing that money in building public housing. Instead, it is going to property investors like the Prime Minister with his 3 investment properties.
This is a great point. The government's losing billions in revenue by handing out these tax concessions, and predominantly they're being given to those who don't really need it because they're already very wealthy. And imagine if some of those billions of dollars were spent improving the housing landscape in Australia.
So is it good or bad?
The reason why it's bad is that it actually gives people an incentive to take out a loan to compete with people who are buying just for a house to live in.
Not just an incentive, the entire tax system in Australia basically screams out to people that they have to buy property and as much as they possibly can. And why wouldn't you? You can loan way more money if you're buying property as opposed to any other asset class. You get amazing tax benefits and all supported by a long history of capital growth.
And if you invest in any other business, you can claim the losses on your tax. That's how it works. These are deductions. Why should this be any different?
If I start up a business, that's not actually preventing someone else starting up a similar business, whereas using negative gearing gives people an advantage that actually reduces the opportunity of other people to own a home.
This is a great point. Yes, if you're trying to start a business, you can claim any losses against your taxable income, but that doesn't directly affect first home buyers, whereas negative gearing most definitely does.
In Parliament today,
day, Albo was under fire for reportedly making $115,000 off his rental properties. Now, should we have a problem with our PM having investment properties?
Yes, we most definitely should, because the PM presided over the highest levels of immigration we've ever seen, which has added rocket fuel to housing demand and sent house prices through the roof, thus personally benefiting from said policy.
I think it's quite interesting that politicians are among the more eager negative gearers in the country. And it's because, once again, politicians earn a lot of money.
Federal politicians as a whole own significantly more property than the average Australian. Now, I don't blame them for buying so many properties, because as we've said, the entire tax system is geared towards incentivizing investment into the housing market. But it is their responsibility to set policies for all Australians, and at the moment, those policies are only benefiting those who own property whilst abandoning everybody else.
You're on your own.
I think it is certainly an issue. It's something that we almost tiptoe around it, assuming, oh no, there's no vested interest in there, they wouldn't act in their own interest. Well, maybe they do.
Just maybe they do.
And it's a case of, it's just one more thing that people who are struggling to get into the housing market are looking at this and going, well, it's pretty rigged.
It's more rigged than loaded dice, when those dice always land on property wins. Now, who's benefiting the most from the distribution of negative gearing tax concessions? If we look at this chart, we can see that around 50% of total concessions claimed are being made or received by those households in the top 20% of overall income. So it's very clear that the households making the most income are receiving the greatest benefit from negative gearing. Now, who's the biggest losers from negative gearing? Well, it's the young. And that's for two main reasons. First, it just creates extra demand for housing, pushing house prices up, making it more unaffordable. But second, they're receiving much lower benefits from negative gearing than those who are older. We can see here that over 70% of negative gearing claims are made by those over 40 years old. So not only did older generations massively benefit from ultra cheap housing, but now they're also getting the lion's share of tax concession benefits as well. Sorry, young people, you just should have been born earlier.
Much earlier.
Now, I know what a lot of people are going to say, because I've heard it thousands of times. If you overhaul negative gearing, rents are going to skyrocket. Now, their reasoning behind this thinking is that if there is an incentive for landlords, there's less rentals available for renters, so there's more demand for rentals, which is going to surge the rent prices. Now, let's consider the validity of this belief. Statistics show that over 90% of properties that are negatively geared result from the purchase of existing properties. So less than 10% of negatively geared claims are for brand new housing. This shows that negative gearing does very little to increase the overall housing supply. So with that in mind, let's consider what would happen if you totally scrapped negative gearing. Someone goes to sell a property and there'd be less overall demand from investors because they can no longer claim any losses against their taxable income. So then who buys the house? Well, if an investor doesn't buy a house, then there's more opportunities for a first homeowner to purchase it. And if the first homeowner can't afford it, well then the seller may have to reduce the house price a little bit until someone's willing to pay the price. So just say a first homeowner household buys that property. That doesn't impact on overall rental supply because you've got one less rental household now who doesn't need to continue renting. In other words, if more people are able to afford their own home, there's less rentals that would be required. So there's absolutely no evidence, in my opinion, that overhauling negative gearing would negatively affect renters. In fact, I believe it would do the absolute opposite, because when you start to reduce speculative demand for property, investors become a lot more cautious and don't just bid any ridiculous price for houses, and that creates a more normalized housing market where houses are kept more affordable in general, and as a result, rents become a lot less volatile. Encouragingly, the debate over property tax concessions in Parliament is really starting to ramp up. Here's another recent example.
Wouldn't you agree with the proposition that those tax settings around negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount advantage property investors over and above people who are currently renting but have the Australian dream of buying their first home? Because the property investors can simply go into the market with those massive subsidies in their pockets and outbid people who are working hard, who are currently getting smashed by high rents, who want to buy their first home, but they don't have those tax advantages that property investors have. I mean, would you accept that proposition?
I don't care what anyone says, negative gearing in its current form is bad policy. It creates added speculation where there doesn't have to be. It encourages investors to loan more and more debt and outbid first home buyers. And it's an absolute gift for those on high incomes to be able to minimise their tax and benefit through house price rises from all the additional demand. Australia is one of the only countries in the entire world that allows negative gearing for property. It's time to start ending the rorts and moving our housing market in the right direction for all Australians. I'm Biko Konstantinos.